The Italian Empire emerged from the same forces that forged modern Italy itself: nationalism, ambition, and the desire for recognition among Europe's great powers. Following centuries of division under foreign rule, the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, proclaimed in 1861, sought not only political consolidation at home, but also prestige abroad. Late to the imperial race, Italy viewed colonial expansion as a way to prove its strength, ease social pressures through emigration, and recover a sense of the grandeur once associated with ancient Rome. Economic weakness, political instability, and uneven development between the industrial North and agrarian South drove leaders to look outward for a national purpose. The defeat of Ethiopia at Adwa in 1896 delayed those ambitions, but by the early 20th century, Italy had regained momentum, seizing Libya and the Dodecanese Islands from the Ottoman Empire in 1911 to 1912. Under Benito Mussolini, imperial expansion reached its peak with the conquest of Ethiopia in 1936, forming Italian East Africa. Yet the empire's collapse during World War II and its formal end by 1960 reflected the instability of a state that built its global reach on fragile foundations. The roots of this empire, however, lay far earlier, in the long and complex struggle to unify the Italian peninsula itself. Before the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed in 1861, the Italian peninsula existed as a patchwork of states shaped by centuries of warfare, dynastic control, and foreign domination. The 19th century opened under the shadow of the Congress of Vienna, 1815, which sought to restore the pre-Napoleonic balance of power after the collapse of Napoleon's empire. The result was a political map that preserved fragmentation. The Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont in the northwest under the House of Savoy, the Lombardo-Venetian Kingdom directly ruled by the Austrian Empire, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, Duchies of Modena and Parma, and the Papal States dominating central Italy, and in the south the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies under the Bourbon dynasty. Foreign soldiers, Austrian garrisons, and clerical administrations enforced Vienna's settlement. Italian sovereignty, in practical terms, did not exist. The return of Austrian influence provoked discontent among intellectuals and veterans who had served in Napoleonist armies. These men, familiar with the ideals of equality and constitutional government, saw unification not merely as a political goal, but as a continuation of Enlightenment rationalism and liberal reform. Secret associations such as the Carbonari, charcoal burners, emerged across Naples and northern Italy between 1815 and 1820. Their networks blended nationalism with a liberal agenda, constitutional monarchy, civil rights, and freedom from Austrian interference. Sporadic uprisings followed: the Neapolitan Revolution of 1820 and the Piedmont Revolt of 1821, both inspired by Spanish constitutionalists and crushed swiftly by Austrian intervention under the Holy Alliance system. These early failures exposed a key weakness. Italy lacked a unified military and a central leadership capable of coordinating rebellion across regional lines. By the 1830s, Italian nationalism evolved from scattered conspiracies into an ideological movement known as the Risorgimento, resurgence, or rebirth. Its intellectual center was Giuseppe Mazzini, a Genoese Republican exiled to Marseille. In 1831, he founded Young Italy, Giovine Italia, an organization dedicated to forging a united, democratic republic through moral education and revolutionary action. Mazzini rejected dynastic compromise. He envisioned a nation born from the people, not bestowed by princes. His writings, Doveri dell'uomo, Duties of Man, foremost among them, linked national independence to universal human progress, influencing activists well beyond Italy. Mazzini's conspiracies inspired uprisings in Savoy, Modena, Parma, and the papal legations in 1831, but these again failed under Austrian suppression. Despite defeat, his ideas disseminated widely among students, artisans, and middle-class professionals. The Risorgimento gained a moral rather than military foothold, a faith that Italy must be one and free. It also inspired later leaders who, while rejecting Mazzini's republicanism, inherited his conviction that unification was inevitable. Parallel to Mazzini's republican current, a pragmatic vision emerged in the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, whose constitutional monarchy after 1848 became a refuge for exiles. The Statuto Albertino, granted by King Charles Albert during the revolutions of 1848, survived later reaction and gave Piedmont a limited parliament and civil liberties, a unique feature among the Italian states. This institutional stability provided a base for moderate liberals seeking unification under monarchical, not revolutionary, leadership. The central architect of this approach was Count Camillo Benso di Cavour, who became prime minister in 1852. Influenced by British and French liberalism, Cavour believed unification must proceed through diplomacy, industrial modernization, and alliances with major powers rather than insurrection. He expanded railways, promoted commerce through the Cavour-Ploen Treaty with France and Britain, and reformed the army. These domestic advances positioned Piedmont as the nucleus of a future Italian state capable of commanding respect in European diplomacy. The wider European revolutions of 1848 provided Italy a major, though short-lived, opening. Popular uprisings erupted in Milan, Venice, Parma, Tuscany, and Rome, demanding constitutional governments and Austrian withdrawal. Charles Albert of Piedmont declared war on Austria in March 1848 in what became the First War of Italian Independence. Initially successful at Goito and Peschiera, his forces were decisively defeated at Custoza, July 1848, and Novara, March 1849. Charles Albert abdicated in favor of his son Victor Emmanuel II. Meanwhile, Giuseppe Garibaldi, a veteran of South American wars, returned to lead volunteer forces in defense of revolutionary governments, most notably the Roman Republic, 1849. That republic, proclaimed after Pope Pius IX fled to Gaeta, introduced social reforms and abolished clerical privileges before being crushed by French troops sent by President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte to restore papal authority. By 1850, the peninsula was again under reactionary rule, except in Piedmont, which retained its constitution and parliamentary system. Yet the revolutions left a durable legacy. Nationalism had gained mass resonance, and Victor Emmanuel II's survival offered a constitutional monarch around whom liberals and moderates could coalesce. Cavour's long game was to internationalize the Italian question. During the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, he sent 18,000 Piedmontese troops to fight alongside Britain. In France, securing a seat at the Congress of Paris, 1856, where he raised the issue of Austrian domination. The strategy succeeded. Italy's plight became a European concern. Cavour then struck a secret alliance with Napoleon III of France at Plombières, July 1858. France would support Piedmont in a defensive war against Austria in exchange for Savoy and Nice. The plan unfolded in April 1859, when Austria demanded that Piedmont demobilize. Cavour refused, prompting the Second War of Italian Independence. French and Piedmontese forces won major battles at Magenta, June 4, 1859, and Solferino, June 24, 1859. The victories forced Austria to cede Lombardy to France, which transferred it to Piedmont. However, Napoleon III, alarmed by casualties and potential Prussian reaction, signed the Armistice of Villafranca, halting further gains. Cavour resigned in protest, but returned as public momentum continued to favor unification. In 1860, central Italian duchies, Parma, Modena, Tuscany, and the Romagna region of the Papal States, voted in plebiscites to join Piedmont, expanding its territory dramatically. The northern consolidation set the stage for Garibaldi's audacious expedition of the Thousand. With roughly 1,000 volunteers, the Red Shirts, he sailed from Quarto near Genoa on May 5, 1860, landing at Marsala, Sicily, 2 days later. Exploiting local resentment against Bourbon misrule, his forces swept through Sicily, defeating royal troops at Calatafimi, May 15th, and capturing Palermo, June 6th. Crossing to the mainland, Garibaldi advanced through Calabria and entered Naples, September 7, 1860, virtually unopposed. His goal remained a unified Italy under Victor Emmanuel II, not a republican secession. To prevent conflict between Garibaldi's volunteers and Piedmontese regulars, Cavour ordered an army to move south through the Papal States, defeating Papal forces at Castelfidardo, September 18th. The two armies met at Tino, October 26, 1860, where Garibaldi hailed Victor Emmanuel as King of Italy. Subsequent plebiscites in the south ratified annexation to the Kingdom of Sardinia. The Bourbon monarchy of the two Sicilies collapsed, and nearly the entire peninsula, save for Venice and Rome, was under Savoyard control. The new state required formal recognition. On March 17, 1861, the Parliament of Turin proclaimed the Kingdom of Italy, declaring Victor Emmanuel II its first king by the grace of God and the will of the nation. Cavour, as prime minister, emphasized continuity rather than revolution. Institutions of the old Sardinian state extended over the peninsula. Turin served as the temporary capital, symbolizing northern leadership, yet foreshadowing the Roman question that remained unresolved. Cavour died only 3 months later, on June 6, 1861, before witnessing full unification. His death left the fledgling kingdom without its most skillful statesman. Nonetheless, his policies, constitutional monarchy, modernization, and cautious diplomacy, endured as guiding principles. At this point, the new Italy lacked Venetia, still under Austrian control, and Rome, held by French troops protecting the Pope. These absences underscored the incomplete nature of unification, yet the foundation of a national government, currency, and army marked a decisive break from centuries of division. Italy's formation fit a wider 19th century pattern of national consolidation. The process revealed that nation-building in the modern era required both ideology and realpolitik, moral vision and military force intertwined. On March 17, 1861, the the Parliament of Turin officially proclaimed the creation of the Kingdom of Italy. Victor Emmanuel II, formerly King of Sardinia-Piedmont, became the first monarch of the new unified state. The proclamation marked the legal and political birth of modern Italy, but unification was incomplete. Venetia remained under Austrian control, and Rome was still governed by the Pope, protected by French troops. The electorate represented less than 2% of the population, largely restricted to property-owning males. While the system gave an appearance of liberal government, real power rested with the monarchy, and the political elite concentrated in the north. The capital of the new kingdom was initially Turin, the historic center of the Savoyard monarchy. The selection was politically symbolic, but geographically inconvenient for the southern provinces recently annexed from the former Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. In 1865, in an attempt to balance regional tensions and signal national unity, the capital was moved to Florence. The decision angered Turin's citizens and did little to satisfy those who regarded Rome as the only legitimate capital of a united Italy. Following unification, the Italian government faced the challenge of integrating regions that had long operated under different legal, administrative, and economic systems. The North was relatively industrialized and literate, with established infrastructures, while the South remained largely agrarian, impoverished, and dominated by landowners. The process of centralization involved the standardization of taxation, legal codes, and military service. The Piedmontese model of administration imposed uniform laws and bureaucratic practices across all territories. While efficient from a governmental standpoint, it alienated local populations unaccustomed to northern institutions. Resistance to the new order emerged quickly, particularly in southern Italy. Between 1861 and 1865, the South experienced widespread unrest known as the Brigantaggio, a rural insurgency involving former Bourbon soldiers, peasants, and local bandits. The insurgents opposed heavy taxation, forced conscription, and the presence of northern troops. The Italian army deployed more than 100,000 soldiers to suppress the rebellion. Harsh reprisals followed, including executions and the destruction of villages. By 1865, the movement had largely been crushed, but the conflict deepened the north-south divide that persisted throughout Italian history. The new state branded the brigands as criminals rather than political opponents, portraying the repression as a campaign for national order. Despite progress, regional inequality widened as industrial investment concentrated in Lombardy, Piedmont, and Liguria, while the South lagged. The first Italian census in 1861 recorded a population of approximately 22 million. Literacy rates were below 30%, with northern provinces averaging over 50% and southern provinces below 15%. The government promoted public education to create a shared national identity and reduce illiteracy. The Cassati Law of 1859, extended to the entire kingdom, made primary education compulsory but poorly enforced, especially in rural areas. The result was uneven national integration, a legal union without full cultural or social cohesion. Foreign policy during this period aimed at completing unification and gaining recognition as a legitimate European power. The main obstacle was Austria's control of Venetia and France's occupation of Rome. Prime Minister Bettino Ricasoli, who succeeded Cavour after his death in June 1861, maintained cautious diplomacy while strengthening the army. Relations with France were complex. Napoleon III, though an ally in 1859, was now the protector of the Papal States and reluctant to withdraw French troops from Rome. Italian nationalists, particularly Giuseppe Garibaldi, continued to press for full unification by force if necessary. In 1862, Garibaldi attempted to march on Rome with a volunteer army under the slogan "Rome or Death." The Italian government, fearing international conflict with France, intervened. On August 29, 1862, at the Battle of Aspromonte, Italian troops blocked Garibaldi's advance in Calabria, wounding and arresting him. The confrontation exposed the government's dilemma. It sought unification but could not risk war with France or the papacy. Diplomatic opportunity returned during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Italy allied with Prussia under King Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck, entering the conflict on June 20, 1866, with the promise of Venetia in exchange for military support. The Italian army, commanded by General Alfonso La Marmora, suffered defeat at Custoza, June 24, 1866, while the Italian Navy lost the Battle of Lissa, July 20, 1866, against the Austrians. Despite these setbacks, Prussia's victory over Austria at Zadova, July 3, 1866, forced Vienna to cede Venetia to France, which transferred it to Italy on October 19, 1866. The acquisition completed unification in the north and marked a diplomatic rather than military success for Italy. The final territorial goal remained Rome. French troops still protected the Papal States, and Pope Pius IX refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Italian kingdom. The situation changed with the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in July 1870. As Napoleon III withdrew French forces from Rome to defend France, Italy seized the opportunity. On September 20, 1870, Italian forces under General Raffaele Cadorna breached the Aurelian walls at the Porta Pia, entering Rome with minimal resistance. The papal army capitulated, and the temporal power of the Pope ended. The annexation of Rome was confirmed by plebiscite in October 1870, with overwhelming support for union with Italy. In July 1871, the Italian parliament officially declared Rome the capital of the kingdom. The government moved from Florence, establishing its seat in the new political and symbolic heart of the nation. Pope Pius IX, rejecting the legitimacy of Italian rule, declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, inaugurating the so-called Roman question, a standoff between church and state that would remain unresolved until the Lateran Treaty of 1929. The period between 1861 and 1871 transformed Italy from a fragmented collection of states into a consolidated kingdom with recognized borders. The unification process, however, revealed persistent divisions, economic inequality, regional antagonism, and the tension between secular and religious authority. The Italian government's reliance on Piedmontese administrative systems imposed a centralized structure on a diverse population. While the territorial framework was completed by 1871, the creation of a unified national consciousness remained a long and difficult process. Italy entered the 1870s as a newly born state with a constitutional monarchy, a central bureaucracy, and ambitions for modernization. It possessed the outward form of unity, but carried internal fractures inherited from centuries of division. The political leadership now faced the challenge of turning territorial unification into functional nationhood through social, economic, and institutional consolidation. After the capture of Rome in 1870 and its formal designation as the capital in 1871, the Kingdom of Italy entered a decade defined by administrative consolidation, economic reconstruction, and political experimentation. The process of national unification had created a state, but not yet a cohesive nation. The new government faced the task of integrating diverse regions that differed in language, economy, and political culture, while attempting to position Italy among the established powers of Europe. The first governments of United Italy were dominated by moderate liberal politicians drawn largely from the north, particularly Piedmont. Giovanni Lanza, Marco Minghetti, and later Agostino de Pretis served as prime ministers during this period, representing a parliamentary elite known as the Destra Storica, historical right. Their policies reflected the Piedmontese model of strong central authority, fiscal discipline, and cautious modernization. The government sought to standardize laws, education, taxation, and administration across the peninsula. The Civil Code of 1865 and the Penal Code of 1889, drafted later but rooted in this period, laid the foundation for national legal uniformity. One of the first tasks of the new kingdom was to balance the national budget, which had been strained by wars and the costs of unification. The Destra implemented a strict program of fiscal austerity, reducing public expenditure and increasing taxation. The grist tax introduced in 1868 continued to burden the rural population, especially in southern Italy, where economic conditions were fragile. By 1876, however, through consistent financial control and new tariffs, Italy achieved a balanced budget for the first time. The policy established financial credibility but came at the expense of popular support, as taxation remained heavy and economic growth uneven. The economic divide between the North and the South widened during this period. Northern Italy, particularly the regions of Piedmont, Lombardy, and Liguria, began industrializing with the development of railways, textile manufacturing, and metal industries. Politically, Italy remained under limited suffrage. The 1861 electoral law restricted voting to property-owning males who paid a minimum tax, excluding over 90% of adult men from political participation. This created a narrow ruling class dominated by landowners, industrialists, and professionals. The parliamentary system often functioned as an exchange of favors rather than ideological competition. Political alliances were fluid, based on personal influence rather than organized parties. This practice later became known as trasformismo, a strategy by which governments maintained parliamentary majorities through compromise and co-optation rather than clear policy mandates. Education became a central instrument for building a shared national identity. The Capino Law of 1877 made elementary education compulsory for children between the ages of 6 and 9 and removed religious instruction from the curriculum, reflecting the secular stance of the liberal state. Literacy rates began to improve, particularly in the north, though progress remained slow in rural and southern regions. The goal was to promote a sense of Italian citizenship through language and civic education. The introduction of standardized Italian, derived from the Tuscan dialect, gradually reduced regional linguistic barriers, though local dialects continued to dominate daily communication. Relations between the state and the Catholic Church remained tense following the annexation of Rome. Pope Pius IX had declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, and in 1871, the Law of Guarantees attempted to define his privileges and the Church's position within the new state. The law recognized the Pope's personal inviolability and provided an annual allowance, while confirming the government's control over church property and appointments. The Vatican rejected the arrangement, maintaining that only full restoration of papal sovereignty would resolve the issue. In response, the papacy issued the non-expedit decree forbidding Catholics from participating in national elections. This policy isolated the Church from political life and contributed to the secular tone of Italian liberalism. Foreign policy during this period was cautious and defensive. Italy's leadership recognized that the young kingdom lacked the military and economic strength to challenge major European powers directly. Nevertheless, nationalists viewed the possession of colonies as essential to international prestige. Italian ports and shipyards expanded, and interest grew in establishing influence in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. However, formal colonial ventures were delayed until the 1880s due to domestic instability and financial constraints. The 1870s also marked Italy's entry into a broader European system of trade and diplomacy. The government negotiated commercial treaties with France, Britain, and Austria-Hungary, liberalizing trade and encouraging exports. Industrial production increased modestly, driven by textile manufacturing in Lombardy and the growth of shipbuilding in Genoa. Financial institutions such as the Banca Nazionale del Regno d'Italia provided credit for infrastructure development, laying the foundation for future industrial expansion. In 1876, the long-dominant destra storica lost power following a parliamentary shift. Agostino de Pretis, leader of the Sinistra Storica historical left, became prime minister, initiating a new phase in Italian politics. His rise marked the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political groups in modern Italy. De Pretis promised reforms to broaden suffrage, reduce taxation, and improve social conditions, but his policies often mirrored those of his predecessors. He consolidated his majority through trasformismo, incorporating conservative deputies into his cabinet and blurring ideological distinctions between left and right. The power shift, however, reflected growing pressure for a more inclusive political system. De Pretis introduced electoral reform in 1882, expanding the franchise to all literate men over 21 who paid minimal taxes, increasing the electorate from about 500,000 to over 2 million voters. The reform was limited but symbolically significant, marking a slow democratization of the state. The new law also reorganized parliamentary districts, improving representation in urban areas where literacy and political participation were higher. Military modernization accompanied these political reforms. The army, which had grown to over 300,000 men by 1880, was reorganized along national lines. Conscription was standardized, requiring 3 years of active service. The government invested in coastal defenses and the development of a navy to protect Mediterranean interests. The army's role in suppressing southern revolts and maintaining order made it a key instrument of state authority. The decade also witnessed social and cultural developments aimed at shaping a unified identity. National monuments, such as the Victor Emmanuel II monument in Rome, planned in 1880, symbolized unity and continuity with the Risorgimento. Public holidays commemorate the proclamation of the kingdom and the capture of Rome. Historical education emphasized the heroes of unification, Cavour, Garibaldi, and Mazzini, as symbols of national virtue and sacrifice. Economically, Italy pursued modernization but remained dependent on agriculture. Industrial growth concentrated in a few northern cities, while most Italians worked the land. Between 1871 and 1881, agricultural production improved modestly due to the introduction of new crops and machinery, but poverty persisted, especially in the Mezzogiorno. The lack of land reform and the dominance of absentee landlords prevented significant progress. These conditions fed continued emigration and occasional unrest. By 1882, Italy had achieved political stability compared to the turbulent decades of unification. The liberal parliamentary system functioned, the budget was balanced, and limited industrial growth had begun. However, the foundations of national weakness remained visible: regional inequality, restricted democracy, and limited resources. The ruling elite increasingly sought to address these deficiencies through outward expansion. The next phase of Italian history would see the kingdom turning toward colonial ambitions, aiming to claim its place among the European powers. By 1882, the Kingdom of Italy had survived its first 2 decades and entered a new phase marked by outward expansion, cautious industrial growth, and shifting political alliances. The internal consolidation achieved under the Destra Storica and the Sinistra Storica gave way to a search for recognition abroad. Italy sought to become a colonial and diplomatic power comparable to the established European empires. Yet beneath the outward ambition lay continuing divisions between North and South, city and countryside, elite and working class. Prime Minister Agostino de Pretis, who remained in office intermittently between 1876 and 1887, steered Italy into a new diplomatic orientation. In 1882, Italy joined the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The agreement was defensive, committing each power to support the others if attacked by France or Russia. Italy's entry reflected a pragmatic calculation. France, which had occupied Tunisia in 1881, an area Italian nationalists had coveted, was now seen as a rival. The alliance provided a sense of security and access to the German market, but also linked Italy to powers whose strategic interests in the Balkans and the Adriatic were not fully aligned with its own. At home, De Pretis continued his policy of trasformismo, blurring distinctions between left and right through compromise and patronage. His later years in office saw limited reforms, including modest reductions in the grist tax and expansion of public education. The government encouraged infrastructure development, such as railway extensions and harbor improvements. However, corruption and inefficiency were widespread, and many projects benefited political allies rather than the broader public. In the early 1880s, Italy began its first colonial ventures. Motivated by the desire for international prestige and new markets, the government authorized expansion along the Red Sea coast. Italian traders and soldiers established footholds in Assab Bay, 1882, and Massawa, 1885, both located in present-day Eritrea. Initially justified as commercial outposts, these settlements soon became the nucleus of Italy's first overseas colony. The move drew attention from Britain and France, who were also expanding their empires in Africa. Italy's position was delicate. It lacked the resources of the major colonial powers but sought equal recognition among them. Depretis died in 1887 and was succeeded by Francesco Crispi, a former revolutionary turned statesman. Crispi's leadership marked a new phase of assertive nationalism and administrative centralization. A supporter of strong executive authority, he sought to modernize Italy's institutions and transform it into a respected European power. He strengthened the army, expanded the navy, and pursued colonial expansion aggressively. Crispi admired Otto von Bismarck's model of national power and saw Italy's future in emulating Germany's path to modernization and influence. Under Crispi's government, the colony of Eritrea was formally established in 1890. Italy then moved into the highlands of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, seeking to expand its control inland. This ambition led to conflict with Emperor Menelik II, who sought to unify Ethiopia and resist European intrusion. Tensions escalated following the disputed Treaty of Wuchel, 1889. The Italian version of the treaty implied that Ethiopia was an Italian protectorate, while the Amharic text omitted this clause. When Menelik rejected Italy's interpretation, war followed. In 1895, Italy launched a military campaign into Ethiopia, confident in its European organization and weaponry. However, at the Battle of Adwa, March 1, 1896, Ethiopian forces decisively defeated the Italian army. Approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers were killed, and the remainder were captured or routed. The defeat was catastrophic for national pride and marked one of the first major African victories against a European power during the colonial era. It forced Italy to recognize Ethiopian independence in the Treaty of Addis Ababa, 1896, and to withdraw to Eritrea. The failure at Adwa deeply affected Italian politics. Crispi, blamed for the defeat and for authoritarian tendencies, resigned. His fall marked a temporary retreat from aggressive foreign policy and led to renewed focus on internal reform. Despite the setback, Eritrea remained under Italian control, and expansion towards Somalia continued through protectorate agreements signed in the 1890s with local sultanates, forming the basis of Italian Somaliland. Domestically, the 1880s and 1890s saw the emergence of new political and social forces. Industrialization, though limited, accelerated in the north, particularly in the Po Valley and around Milan, Turin, and Genoa. Textile production, metallurgy, and mechanical industries expanded. By 1890, Italy had roughly 2 million industrial workers, and a growing urban working class began to demand labor rights and representation. In 1892, the Italian Socialist Party, PSI, was founded in Genoa, advocating social reform, universal suffrage, and improved working conditions. The rise of socialism marked the first organized challenge to the liberal establishment. The government's response to labor unrest was inconsistent, sometimes conciliatory, often repressive. Strikes in Milan, 1898, and other industrial centers were met with military force. In Milan, troops under General Bava Bakaris fired on demonstrators protesting food shortages and high bread prices, killing hundreds. The episode, known as the Bava Bakaris massacre, led to widespread condemnation and the resignation of Prime Minister Antonio di Rudini. King Umberto I, however, decorated the general for restoring order, alienating much of the population. In 1900, Umberto was assassinated in Monza by the anarchist Gaetano Bresci, who claimed to avenge the victims of state repression. The assassination brought Victor Emmanuel III to the throne. The young monarch inherited a country strained by social conflict, economic inequality, and political division. Italy's parliamentary system was showing signs of fatigue. Political corruption persisted, and the practice of trasformismo prevented clear party alignment or coherent policy direction. Despite formal democracy, only a fraction of citizens could vote, and politics remained dominated by local patronage networks. Economically, Italy's progress was uneven. The tariff reforms of 1887, implemented by Crispi's government, introduced protectionist duties to shield domestic industries from foreign competition, particularly French agricultural and industrial imports. France retaliated with its own tariffs, sparking a trade war that damaged both economies but accelerated Italy's push for self-sufficiency. Protectionism encouraged domestic production of steel, machinery, and chemicals, while also fueling tensions with France that would shape Italian diplomacy for years. The Southern question, the persistent economic and social backwardness of southern Italy, remained unresolved. The government attempted limited interventions, such as tax relief and infrastructure projects, but poverty, illiteracy, and land inequality continued. Banditry and unrest persisted in rural areas, while immigration increased dramatically. Between 1880 and 1900, over 4 million Italians left the country, primarily from the south. Immigrants sent remittances home, which became an important source of income for rural families and a stabilizing factor for the fragile economy. Meanwhile, intellectual and cultural movements reflected Italy's search for identity. Nationalist writers and historians revisited the legacy of the Risorgimento, emphasizing unity and progress. At the same time, socialist thinkers such as Filippo Turati and Anna Kolyshov articulated class-based critiques of the liberal state, arguing that Italy's political system served only the interests of the wealthy. The Catholic Church, though officially excluded from politics by the non-expedit, began to reassert moral influence through local parishes, social organizations, and educational institutions. Foreign relations in the late 19th century were guided by caution and pragmatism. Italy maintained its alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, renewing the Triple Alliance in 1887 and 1891, while also improving relations with Britain. Despite colonial setbacks, Italy remained committed to maintaining influence in the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. Naval modernization continued, supported by new shipyards in La Spezia and Taranto, preparing Italy for greater maritime projection. By the turn of the 20th century, Italy had become a constitutional monarchy with a functioning parliamentary system, a small but growing industrial base, and the beginnings of an overseas empire. Yet the country remained divided and politically fragile. Industrial workers in the north demanded reform. Peasants in the south lived in persistent poverty, and nationalist groups demanded renewed expansion to restore Italy's international status after Adwa. The stage was set for the turbulent decades that would follow, as Italy entered the 20th century seeking both stability and recognition among the world's powers. After the defeat at Adwa in 1896, Italy entered a period of reassessment and internal reconstruction. The loss had been a national humiliation, exposing the limits of its military capacity and undermining its ambition to be counted among the great European empires. Politically, socially, and economically, Italy began to redirect its focus inward, seeking to consolidate its domestic institutions, stabilize the economy, and restore public confidence in the government. The first major shift came under the leadership of Antonio di Rudini, who became prime minister following Crispi's resignation in 1896. His administration pursued a cautious foreign policy, avoiding military entanglements while rebuilding relations with European powers. Diplomatic efforts sought to repair Italy's reputation, particularly with Britain and France, and to maintain its standing within the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Rudini reduced military spending and introduced modest administrative reforms, but faced growing challenges from labor movements, anarchists, and socialists who criticized the government's failure to address inequality and unemployment. Domestically, the Italian economy remained fragile. Industrialization had made progress in the north, especially in Lombardy, Piedmont, and Liguria, but southern Italy continued to lag. The Mezzogiorno suffered from poor infrastructure, fragmented land ownership, and limited access to education. The government attempted to stimulate development through tax relief and limited land reform, yet the structural divide persisted. The Southern question, the imbalance between North and South, became a defining issue in Italian politics, shaping debates for decades. Rudini's tenure was marked by growing social unrest. The Fasci Siciliani, a socialist and peasant movement active in Sicily since the early 1890s, had already demonstrated the depth of rural discontent. Although brutally suppressed in 1894, similar protests continued to erupt in the following years. Strikes by agricultural workers, miners, and urban laborers spread across the peninsula. The government responded inconsistently, alternating between limited concessions and the use of force. By 1898, economic hardship and high food prices triggered widespread riots in northern and central Italy. The most severe unrest occurred in Milan, where demonstrators protesting the rising cost of bread were met with military repression. General Fiorenzo Bava Beccaris ordered his troops to fire on the crowd, killing and wounding hundreds. The incident, known as the Bava Beccaris massacre, shocked public opinion and exposed the state's reliance on violence to maintain order. Rudini's government lost credibility, and resentment toward the monarchy grew when King Umberto I awarded Bava Beccaris a medal for restoring peace. The resulting political instability culminated in the assassination of King Umberto I on July 29, 1900 by the anarchist Gaetano Bresci, who claimed revenge for the massacre victims. The crown passed to Victor Emmanuel III, whose reign would last until 1946. The new king faced a divided country and a discredited political system dominated by patronage and corruption. The practice of trasformismo, where shifting alliances blurred ideological distinctions, had produced governments that were stable in form but weak in substance. Following Rudini, a series of short-lived governments struggled to maintain control. Giuseppe Sirocco, Giovanni Giolitti, and Giuseppe Zanardelli each served as prime minister between 1900 and 1903. Among them, Giolitti emerged as the most capable statesman of the era. His influence would define Italian politics for the next 2 decades. A liberal reformer with pragmatic instincts, Giolitti believed that Italy could be strengthened through gradual modernization, social reform, and balanced economic growth. Giolitti's early governments emphasized industrial expansion, state intervention, and conciliation with labor. He sought to integrate the working class into the political system rather than suppress it. Under his leadership, strikes were tolerated if peaceful, and new labor laws improved working conditions and limited child labor. The franchise was expanded modestly, although universal male suffrage would not come until 1912. Economically, Italy entered a phase of moderate growth known as the Giolittian era. The state invested heavily in railways, energy infrastructure, and public works. Industrial output increased significantly, especially in metallurgy, textiles, and mechanical engineering. Turin became a center of automobile production with the founding of Fiat, Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, in 1899, symbolizing the rise of modern industry. Urbanization accelerated as workers moved from rural areas to industrial cities. The government encouraged financial stability through protective tariffs, support for banks, and expansion of the national rail network. However, prosperity remained uneven. The North benefited from industrialization, while the South remained largely agricultural and impoverished. Many Southern Italians continued to emigrate, with an estimated 8 million people leaving the country between 1900 and 1914, primarily to the Americas. Emigration provided economic relief but deepened the demographic and cultural divide within Italy. Giolitti also sought to reconcile relations between the state and the Catholic Church, strained since the capture of Rome in 1870. The Non-Expedit Decree, which prohibited Catholics from participating in parliamentary elections, had isolated much of the population from political life. During Giolitti's tenure, the gradual relaxation of the decree began, and Catholic associations gained a degree of tolerance. This cautious rapprochement helped reduce tensions between secular liberals and the Church, paving the way for broader political participation in later years. Foreign policy during this period reflected restraint and pragmatism. After the failure in Ethiopia, Italy avoided new colonial wars while maintaining its positions in Eritrea and Somaliland. Diplomatic efforts aimed to preserve the Triple Alliance and improve relations with Britain and France. Italy supported European balance of power politics, but remained wary of being drawn into great power rivalries. By the early 1900s, the Italian military was undergoing modernization. The army introduced new artillery, improved logistics, and expanded conscription to strengthen national defense. The Navy, seen as essential to Italy's security and prestige, launched new battleships and established modern shipyards at Taranto and La Spezia. These reforms, while limited by financial constraints, reflected the growing view that Italy must be ready to defend and project its influence abroad. Culturally, this era was one of intellectual ferment and social transition. The rise of mass literacy, the spread of newspapers, and the growth of civic associations broadened public awareness. Writers and thinkers debated Italy's national identity and its place in the modern world. Positivist and socialist ideas gained influence among the educated classes, challenging traditional liberal ideals. Despite progress, underlying tensions persisted. Rapid industrialization led to the formation of strong trade unions and socialist organizations, which clashed with employers and conservative interests. The Italian Socialist Party, PSI, gained parliamentary representation and became a significant political force, advocating social justice, labor rights, and anti-militarism. Meanwhile, nationalist movements, dissatisfied with Italy's limited role abroad, demanded renewed imperial expansion to restore prestige lost at Ottawa. By 1910, Italy's situation had improved compared to the crisis of the 1890s. The economy was stronger, the political system more inclusive, and the military better equipped. Yet challenges remained unresolved: economic inequality, the North-South divide, and the competing demands of socialism and nationalism. The combination of growing industrial power and renewed national confidence encouraged the belief that Italy was ready to pursue expansion once more. This climate of cautious optimism and ambition would soon lead Italy into a new phase of imperial activity. The opportunity presented itself in North Africa, where the weakening Ottoman Empire controlled territories long coveted by Italian nationalists. Within a year, Italy would embark on its next major colonial war, the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 to 1912, reigniting its imperial aspirations and marking the transition from domestic reconstruction to global competition. By the beginning of the 20th century, Italy's leaders regarded colonial expansion as both a strategic necessity and a matter of national prestige. The failures in East Africa had been partly redeemed by domestic progress under Giovanni Giolitti, but among nationalists, there remained a conviction that Italy's place in the world depended on acquiring new territories. The Ottoman Empire's gradual decline created an opening. Its North African provinces, particularly Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, modern Libya, were viewed as the last unclaimed region in the Mediterranean suitable for colonization. The idea of occupying Libya had circulated in Italian political and economic circles for decades. Italian banks and trading companies already operated in the region, and newspapers such as Corriere della Sera and La Tribuna published articles depicting it as fertile and rich in resources. In reality, the territory was sparsely populated, arid, and of limited economic value, but its proximity to Sicily made it strategically attractive. France's expansion into Tunisia, 1881, and Britain's control of Egypt, 1882, had left Italy the only Mediterranean power without a North African colony. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, who returned to office in 1911, initially approached the issue with caution. He understood the financial strain and diplomatic risks of war, but faced increasing pressure from the Nationalist Association and major business interests advocating intervention. Public opinion, influenced by a coordinated press campaign, shifted in favor of conquest. The government also feared that France, after consolidating Tunisia and Algeria, might annex Libya, closing Italy's last opportunity for African expansion. Tensions between Italy and the Ottoman Empire escalated through 1911. On September 29, 1911, Italy issued an ultimatum demanding Ottoman withdrawal from Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. When Istanbul refused, Italy declared war the same day, beginning the Italo-Turkish War. The campaign represented Italy's first major military operation since Ottawa and tested its reformed armed forces. The initial phase of the war focused on securing coastal cities. Italian naval superiority allowed the rapid occupation of key ports. Tripoli fell on October 5, 1911, followed by Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk later that month. The Italian Navy also blockaded the Dardanelles and bombarded Ottoman positions in the Aegean, disrupting communication between Turkey and its North African territories. However, beyond the coastal towns, the Italians encountered strong resistance from local Arab and Berber tribes supported by Ottoman officers. Ottoman forces, though outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement, conducted effective guerrilla warfare under commanders such as Enver Bey and Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk. Fighting in the desert proved difficult for the Italians, who were unfamiliar with the terrain and climate. Disease, heat, and supply shortages hindered their advance. The Italian army relied heavily on naval artillery and aircraft to support ground operations. This conflict marked a historical milestone in modern warfare. On October 23, 1911, Italy conducted the first aerial reconnaissance mission in history, using airplanes to observe enemy positions near Tripoli. In November, Italian pilots dropped hand grenades from aircraft, initiating the first instance of aerial bombing in warfare. Although primitive, these innovations demonstrated Italy's willingness to use technology to offset tactical challenges. Giolitti's government maintained that the war would be short and decisive. However, by early 1912, the campaign had turned into a prolonged occupation with mounting costs. Italy's parliament grew divided between nationalists celebrating Italy's civilizing mission and socialists condemning the war as imperial aggression. Benito Mussolini, then a socialist journalist, publicly opposed the invasion, calling it a capitalist venture that burdened workers with taxes and death. The Italian military extended operations into the Aegean Sea to pressure the Ottoman Empire into negotiation. In April 1912, Italian forces seized Rhodes and the Dodecanese Islands, territories of the Ottoman Empire in the eastern Mediterranean. The occupation cut Ottoman supply routes and provided Italy with a strategic base. Despite Turkish protests, Italy maintained control over these islands for decades. The turning point came in mid-1912 when both sides, exhausted and facing domestic constraints, sought peace. The Balkan League, comprising Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, was preparing for war against the Ottoman Empire, diverting Ottoman attention from Libya. Italy used this distraction to push for a settlement. Negotiations led to the Treaty of Auchi, also known as the Treaty of Lausanne, signed on October 18, 1912 in Switzerland. Under the treaty's terms, the Ottoman Empire agreed to withdraw its forces and officials from Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and the Fezzan, recognizing Italian occupation. In return, Italy pledged to withdraw from the Dodecanese Islands, although it maintained de facto control over them until 1947. The treaty did not formally cede sovereignty, but effectively transferred administration to Italy, ending Ottoman rule after more than 4 centuries. Following the treaty, Italy organized its new possessions as Libya, combining Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan into a single colony. The name Libya, derived from the ancient Greek term for North Africa, was officially adopted in 1934 but began appearing in administrative use shortly after 1912. The government portrayed the conquest as the realization of Italy's imperial destiny, restoring national pride after the humiliation at Ottawa. However, consolidation of control proved far from complete. Local resistance continued for years, particularly in Cyrenaica, where the Senussi order, an Islamic religious movement, led armed opposition. Italian authority outside coastal areas remained limited, and campaigns to suppress resistance consumed resources and manpower. The colonial administration imposed harsh measures to pacify the population, setting patterns of repression that would deepen under fascist rule 2 decades later. Domestically, the war had mixed consequences. It strengthened nationalist sentiment and temporarily unified public opinion, but it also exposed weaknesses in the state's finances and military organization. The war cost over 1.3 billion lire, nearly doubling the annual defense budget. Italian casualties numbered around 3,000 dead and 4,400 wounded, while Ottoman and Libyan losses were far higher, though poorly recorded. The economic burden led to inflation and labor unrest in industrial centers. Politically, the war expanded Italy's influence abroad but created internal tensions. Nationalists celebrated victory as proof that Italy had joined the ranks of colonial powers. Liberals claimed it demonstrated the success of modernization and national unity. Socialists and Republicans, however, argued that resources spent on foreign conquest should have been used to improve living standards at home. The Italian Socialist Party gained strength among workers, signaling growing polarization within society. In the military sphere, the war provided valuable experience in overseas operations, logistics, and the use of modern weapons. Lessons from the campaign influenced Italy's later military planning, though command inefficiency and lack of coordination persisted. The Navy emerged as the most effective branch, demonstrating Italy's capacity to project power across the Mediterranean. Internationally, the Italo-Turkish War marked the final act of European colonial expansion in North Africa. It weakened the Ottoman Empire and encouraged the Balkan states to launch the First Balkan War in 1912, accelerating the destabilization of southeastern Europe. The success also reinforced Italy's confidence in its role as a Mediterranean power, shaping its foreign policy leading into the First World War. By 1912, Italy had secured its first major overseas colony and reasserted its claim to imperial status. The conquest of Libya and the Dodecanese represented a turning point. Italy had proven capable of conducting an independent military campaign and enforcing its geopolitical ambitions. Yet the apparent triumph masked underlying fragility, economic imbalance, political division, and unresolved domestic challenges that would resurface in the following decade as Italy entered the First World War. By the final decade of the 19th century, the Kingdom of Italy, unified but still politically and economically fragile, sought international prestige through colonial expansion. The drive for colonies was partly a response to domestic pressures. Industrialization was uneven, southern regions lagged behind the north, and immigration drained manpower. Many Italian politicians believed that establishing overseas colonies would project power comparable to Britain, France, and Germany, while also providing raw materials and opportunities for settlement. Italy's first focus was the Horn of Africa. The country's foothold there had developed gradually since the 1880s. Following the Egyptian withdrawal from the Red Sea coast in 1885, Italy occupied the port of Massawa, which became the base for future operations. In 1890, this region was formally declared the colony of Eritrea, with Massawa as its administrative center. Italian control extended inland, though it was often tenuous and contested by local chiefs. At the same time, Italy extended its interests along the southern coast of the Horn, purchasing concessions from the Sultan of Zanzibar. This led to the establishment of Italian Somaliland in 1889. The colony was divided between areas directly governed by Italy and territories administered through local sultans under Italian protection. These two possessions, Eritrea and Somaliland, were intended to serve as the foundation of an East African empire. However, Italy's ambitions quickly collided with those of Ethiopia, then ruled by Emperor Menelik II. Ethiopia had successfully resisted earlier Egyptian and Sudanese incursions, and its control extended over much of the highlands adjacent to the new Italian territories. Italian authorities hoped to convert Ethiopia into a protectorate, using diplomacy supported by limited military pressure. The pivotal document in this process was the Treaty of Wuchel, signed in May 1889. The treaty existed in two versions, Italian and Amharic. The Italian government under Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, a nationalist and former revolutionary, believed a swift victory would demonstrate Italy's strength. In 1895, Italian forces advanced from Eritrea into the northern Ethiopian region of Tigray. Initial engagements favored the Italians. They occupied Adigrat and Adwa and established garrisons at Mekelle and other key points. But Menelik II mobilized a large Ethiopian army, drawing tens of thousands of troops from across his empire, including units commanded by regional leaders such as Ras Alula, Ras Michael, and Ras Makoan. The defeat at Adwa was a historic event. It marked the first time an African army decisively defeated a European colonial power during the scramble for Africa. The Treaty of Addis Ababa in October 1896 ended hostilities and annulled the Treaty of Wuchel. Italy recognized Ethiopia's full independence. In Italy, the loss triggered national humiliation. The Crispi government collapsed soon after the news reached Rome. Anti-colonial protests erupted in several cities, and parliamentary debates questioned the country's entire imperial strategy. The failure of 1896 forced Italian policymakers to shift their attention toward consolidating control over existing territories while reconsidering future ambitions elsewhere in the Mediterranean and North Africa. After the defeat at Adwa in 1896, Italy entered a period of political reassessment. The humiliation exposed weaknesses in the Italian state: poor coordination between government and military, limited industrial capacity, and overconfidence in diplomacy. And Austria-Hungary. Though relations with Vienna were uneasy due to disputes over territories in the Adriatic, attention turned to North Africa, particularly the Ottoman provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, the regions that would later form modern Libya. Italian interests there dated back to the 1880s, when Rome had tried unsuccessfully to acquire these territories during the European partition of Africa. France's occupation of Tunisia in 1881 had frustrated Italy's earlier ambitions and produced lasting resentment. The Italian government saw Tripolitania and Cyrenaica as the logical areas for expansion, close to Sicily and economically promising. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire's control over its North African territories had weakened considerably. Local tribes operated with significant autonomy, and Ottoman administrative presence was limited. Meanwhile, European powers began positioning themselves for possible annexation should the Ottoman state collapse. He concluded that a limited military campaign could secure Libya quickly and enhance Italy's standing without major risk. On September 29, 1911, Italy issued an ultimatum to the Ottoman government demanding control over Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. When the demand was rejected, Italy declared war. The beginning of the Italo-Turkish War, 1911 to 1912. Italian forces first targeted the coastal cities of Tripoli, Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk. The Italian Navy bombarded Ottoman positions, and amphibious landings followed. Despite these technological advances, the Italian army struggled with harsh desert conditions, supply difficulties, and unexpected resistance. The Ottoman defense in Libya relied on a combination of regular soldiers and local tribal forces led by figures such as Enver Bey and Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk. They organized guerrilla warfare from the interior, inflicting casualties and preventing Italy from achieving full occupation. The conflict dragged on far longer than Rome anticipated, consuming significant resources. To pressure the Ottoman Empire, Italy extended the war to other regions. The victory marked Italy's first major success as a colonial power since unification. It restored some of the national pride lost at Ottawa and elevated Italy's international status. However, the occupation remained incomplete. Resistance in the Libyan interior persisted for decades, requiring ongoing military campaigns. The Dodecanese Islands, although initially held as a temporary measure, remained under Italian control beyond the terms of the treaty. The Italo-Turkish War also had broader consequences. It exposed the Ottoman Empire's vulnerability and encouraged Balkan states to form the Balkan League, which soon launched the First Balkan War against the Ottomans in 1912. For Italy, the war confirmed that colonial success was achievable, but also revealed the high cost of maintaining overseas possessions. By 1912, Italy stood as a recognized imperial power with colonies in Eritrea, Somaliland, and Libya, and possessions in the Aegean Sea. The next challenge would come from the shifting European balance of power, which would soon plunge the continent and Italy into the First World War. By the early 1930s, Fascist Italy had stabilized internally but faced economic challenges and sought renewed prestige through territorial expansion. Benito Mussolini, who had ruled since 1922, pursued an aggressive foreign policy rooted in nationalism and imperial revival. He viewed colonial conquest as essential for Italy's status among European powers and as compensation for the mutilated victory of World War I. The regime's propaganda revived the memory of Rome as ancient empire and sought to avenge the defeat at Ottawa in 1896. In 1934, tensions between Italy and Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent states in Africa, began to rise. Both nations were members of the League of Nations, but Mussolini viewed the League as ineffective and was determined to impose Italian control over the Horn of Africa. The immediate pretext for conflict came from an incident on December 5, 1934, at Walwal, an oasis in the Ogaden region near the border between Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia. Italian and Ethiopian troops clashed, resulting in casualties on both sides. Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, appealed to the League of Nations for arbitration. The League called for negotiation but avoided decisive action. Italy used the delay to mobilize large forces in East Africa. By early 1935, over 400,000 Italian troops, including colonial auxiliaries from Eritrea and Somalia, were stationed along the Ethiopian frontier. Diplomatic attempts to prevent war failed. The Stresa Front, an agreement between Italy, Britain, and France in April 1935, sought to maintain European stability. But both Britain and France hesitated to confront Mussolini directly, fearing his potential alignment with Hitler's Germany. This hesitation emboldened the Italian regime. On October 3, 1935, Italy launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia without a formal declaration of war. General Emilio de Bono commanded the Northern Army advancing from Eritrea, while General Rodolfo Graziani led Southern forces from Italian Somaliland. Despite international condemnation, Mussolini presented the campaign as a civilizing mission and a necessary step toward restoring Italian greatness. The Italian army's technological superiority was decisive. Modern artillery, tanks, and aircraft overwhelmed Ethiopian forces, which relied heavily on infantry and outdated weaponry. By December 1935, Italian troops captured Aksum and Adigrat in the north. However, Ethiopian resistance was determined, with large mobilizations known as the Fitterary and Ras commands organizing counterattacks. In early 1936, command passed to General Pietro Badoglio, who intensified operations. The Italians used chemical weapons, including mustard gas, in violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, to break Ethiopian defenses. Aerial bombardments targeted not only military positions, but also villages and Red Cross hospitals. The campaign demonstrated the regime's disregard for international norms. On March 31, 1936, the Battle of Mechu marked the final major Ethiopian attempt to resist. Haile Selassie's army, though large, was defeated by superior firepower. Italian forces entered the capital, Addis Ababa, on May 5, 1936. Mussolini used this defiance to strengthen his domestic position and portray Italy as a nation besieged by jealous rivals. The occupation of Ethiopia completed the formation of Italian East Africa, Africa Orientale Italiana, uniting Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia under a single administrative structure. The new colony covered over 1.7 million square kilometers and was governed from Addis Ababa by a viceroy representing the Italian crown. Infrastructure projects began immediately, including the construction of new roads, railways, and administrative centers to consolidate control. Italian rule in Ethiopia was marked by systematic repression. Resistance movements continued in many regions, particularly in Tigray, Gajam, and Shua, forcing Italy to maintain large garrisons and conduct punitive expeditions. Mass executions, deportations, and the destruction of villages were common. Following an assassination attempt on Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani on February 19, 1937, Italian authorities carried out brutal reprisals in Addis Ababa, executing thousands of civilians over several days. Despite the violence, the fascist regime presented the conquest as a triumph of national destiny. In Italy, propaganda depicted Mussolini as a new Caesar, and the creation of the empire became a central theme in fascist ideology. Public works projects were launched to celebrate the achievement, including the Via dell'Impero in Rome and large parades in honor of returning soldiers. The victory also marked Italy's break with traditional diplomatic partners. The League's condemnation pushed Mussolini toward closer cooperation with Nazi Germany. By 1936, Italy and Germany supported the same side in the Spanish Civil War, and the Rome-Berlin axis was formally announced on October 25, 1936. Italy's alignment with Germany represented a strategic shift, replacing earlier efforts to balance relations among European powers with an ideological partnership based on militarism and authoritarian rule. In 1938, Fascist Italy adopted racial laws modeled partly on Nazi policies. These laws segregated colonial populations and banned interracial marriage between Italians and Africans. They also extended discrimination into Italy itself, targeting Jews and reinforcing the idea of a racial hierarchy within the empire. Colonial administration institutionalized forced labor and economic exploitation, particularly in agriculture and resource extraction. The empire reached its geographical peak in 1939 when Italy invaded and annexed Albania on April 7, 1939, transforming it into a protectorate under King Victor Emmanuel III. The addition of Albania further expanded Italy's influence in the Balkans and was presented by Mussolini as proof of Fascist Italy's growing power. By the eve of World War II, Italy controlled vast territories across Africa and the Mediterranean. Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, the Dodecanese Islands, and Albania. However, the empire's strength was superficial. Economic resources were limited, colonial administration was overstretched, and military logistics were inadequate for large-scale warfare. The conquest of Ethiopia marked both the high point and the beginning of the decline of fascist imperialism. Mussolini's ambitions outgrew Italy's capacity, setting the stage for confrontation with the great powers in the coming global conflict. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Italy initially remained non-belligerent. Mussolini's regime watched from the sidelines as Germany overran Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Italy's economy was still recovering from the Ethiopian campaign, and the armed forces lacked fuel, modern equipment, and trained officers. Nonetheless, Mussolini feared that prolonged neutrality would cost Italy its share of post-war rewards. On June 10, 1940, after the German victories in Western Europe, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. He announced the move from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome, presenting Italy's entry as an act of opportunism intended to secure territorial gains. The decision was largely political, made despite the advice of senior military officials who warned that Italy was not prepared for a major conflict. The Italian war effort opened on several fronts at once. In the Alps, Italian divisions crossed into southeastern France but met strong resistance. Their advance achieved little before France signed an armistice with Germany on June 22, 1940. Italy occupied small border areas, including Menton, but gained no significant advantage. In North Africa, Italian forces under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani launched operations from Libya into Egypt, then a British protectorate. In September 1940, about 200,000 Italian troops advanced from Cyrenaica into the Egyptian desert, capturing Sidi Barrani. The offensive stalled within weeks due to poor logistics and insufficient mechanization. In December, British and Commonwealth troops under General Archibald Wavell counterattacked in Operation Compass, pushing Italian forces back across the border. By February 1941, the British had taken Bardia, Tobruk, and Benghazi and captured over 130,000 Italian soldiers. At the same time, Italian East Africa came under pressure. Britain coordinated attacks from Sudan, Kenya, and Aden. Ethiopian resistance, led by patriot forces loyal to Emperor Haile Selassie, worked with the Allies to undermine Italian control. Key battles at Keren, February, March 1941, and Amba Alagi, May 1941, destroyed Italy's main defensive positions. Addis Ababa fell on April 6, 1941, and by November 1941, organized resistance had ended. Haile Selassie returned to his capital in May 1941, restoring Ethiopian sovereignty and formally ending Italian rule in East Africa. In Europe, Mussolini sought to demonstrate independence from Germany by launching an invasion of Greece from Albania on October 28, 1940. The plan failed almost immediately. Greek forces counterattacked, pushing Italian troops deep into Albania. The campaign became a military embarrassment that required German intervention. In April 1941, the Wehrmacht invaded both Yugoslavia and Greece, achieving swift victories and rescuing Italy's faltering effort. Italy was permitted to occupy portions of both countries, including parts of Dalmatia, Montenegro, and the Ionian Islands, but effective control remained with the Germans. After the fall of France, Italy expanded its Mediterranean presence, occupying Corsica, Nice, and Tunisian coastal areas. Italian forces also participated in naval operations against the British. The Regia Marina engaged in battles at Taranto, November 1940, and Cape Matapan, March 1941, both of which exposed the limits of Italy's naval power. By 1942, the North African campaign reached its peak. Italian and German troops advanced to El Alamein, only 100 kilometers from Alexandria. The subsequent First Battle of El Alamein, July 1942, halted the Axis advance, and the Second Battle of El Alamein, November 1942, reversed it. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery broke through the Axis lines, initiating a general retreat. Simultaneously, Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, November 8, 1942, creating a two-front war in North Africa. By May 1943, the combined British and American advance captured Tunis, ending Axis resistance on the continent. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoner. The loss of North Africa deprived Italy of its main imperial territories and its last strategic colonies. Within Italy, wartime strain intensified. Allied bombing targeted industrial centers in Milan, Genoa, Turin, and Naples, destroying infrastructure and lowering morale. Food shortages, inflation, and military defeats eroded support for Mussolini's government. Discontent spread among the army and the ruling elite. The final collapse came in July 1943. Following the Allied invasion of Sicily on July 9, 1943, Mussolini faced mounting opposition from within the Fascist Grand Council. On July 25, 1943, he was dismissed by King Victor Emmanuel III and arrested. Marshal Pietro Badoglio assumed control, forming a new government. Although Badoglio initially declared that Italy would continue fighting alongside Germany, secret negotiations with the Allies soon began. An armistice was signed on September 3, 1943, and announced publicly on September 8, 1943. The German army responded by occupying most of Italy, disarming Italian troops, and establishing a puppet state in the north, the Italian Social Republic, under Mussolini's nominal leadership. The southern regions came under Allied control, and Italy effectively split into two zones of occupation. By the end of 1943, Italy's imperial system had disintegrated. Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia were under Allied occupation. Ethiopia had regained independence, and Albania was in German hands. The war exposed the structural weaknesses of Mussolini's empire: overextended, under-resourced, and dependent on Germany. What remained of Italy's military power was confined to defending its own territory from invasion. After the armistice of September 3, 1943, the Kingdom of Italy formally withdrew from the Axis alliance. But the process of surrender and occupation created deep fragmentation. German forces quickly moved to occupy the Italian peninsula, disarming Italian troops and establishing control over central and northern regions. In response, Adolf Hitler reinstalled Benito Mussolini as the head of a new puppet government, the Italian Social Republic, Repubblica Sociale Italiana, RSI, based in Salo on the shores of Lake Garda. The RSI functioned under German supervision, lacking real autonomy. The Kingdom of Italy, under King Victor Emmanuel III and Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio, reconstituted itself in the south under Allied protection, with Brindisi serving as the temporary capital. This dual state marked the division of Italy between Allied and German zones. The south, progressively liberated by the Allies, remained loyal to the monarchy, while the north became a battleground between fascist forces, German occupiers, and the growing Italian resistance. Between 1943 and 1945, Italy became a front line of the European war. German forces constructed defensive positions known as the Gustav Line across central Italy, which slowed the Allied advance for months. The Battle of Monte Cassino, January-May 1944, resulted in heavy casualties and the destruction of the historic abbey. Rome was liberated on June 4, 1944, followed by Florence in August, but the fighting continued until May 2, 1945, when German troops in Italy surrendered. During this period, the Italian Social Republic maintained limited authority. Its military forces, including the National Republican Army and Black Brigades, participated in anti-partisan operations and reprisals. Resistance movements, organized under the Committee of National Liberation, CLN, conducted sabotage, intelligence work, and guerrilla warfare. Partisan units controlled large parts of northern Italy by 1945, particularly in the Piedmont, Emilia-Romagna, and Veneto regions. As the war neared its end, Mussolini attempted to flee north towards Switzerland but was captured by partisans near Dongo on April 27, 1945. He was executed the next day, April 28, 1945, along with several fascist officials. Their bodies were displayed publicly in Milan, symbolizing the definitive collapse of fascism in Italy. German forces in northern Italy surrendered shortly afterward, concluding the Italian campaign. Following the end of hostilities, Italy faced occupation, reconstruction, and political transformation. The country had suffered immense destruction. Industrial centers, ports, and railways were heavily damaged, and over 500,000 Italians had died. The monarchy, discredited by its association with Mussolini's regime, faced growing opposition. On June 2, 1946, a national referendum abolished the monarchy, and Italy was declared a republic. King Victor Emmanuel III abdicated in favor of his son Umberto II, who ruled for only 34 days before going into exile. The post-war settlement stripped Italy of all colonial possessions. The Paris Peace Treaties, signed on February 10, 1947, formally ended Italy's status as an imperial power. The treaties required Italy to renounce sovereignty over its African colonies, Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia, as well as the Dodecanese Islands, which were transferred to Greece. Italy was also required to recognize the independence of Ethiopia, reaffirming the annulment of Mussolini's 1936 annexation. The treaties imposed additional territorial losses in Europe. Istria, Dalmatia, and parts of Julian March were ceded to Yugoslavia, and the Free Territory of Trieste was established under international administration. Italy also recognized the sovereignty of Albania, which had been occupied and annexed in 1939. Financial reparations were another burden. Italy agreed to pay compensation to several countries affected by its wartime actions. $125 million to Greece, $100 million each to Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, $25 million to Ethiopia, and smaller amounts to Albania. These payments further weakened the already fragile post-war economy. In Africa, Italy's former colonies underwent transitional phases under Allied or United Nations supervision. Libya, divided into Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan, came under British and French military administration. Eritrea was placed under British rule, pending a future decision on its political status, while Somalia became a British protectorate. Italian settlers, numbering over 100,000 across Libya and East Africa, were repatriated over the next few years, often leaving behind property and infrastructure. The loss of empire had profound political and psychological consequences. For decades, imperial expansion had served as a central theme of Italian nationalism. With its collapse, the country was forced to redefine its identity within Europe. The government shifted focus toward economic recovery through the Marshall Plan and reintegration into the international community. Domestically, the Constitution of the Italian Republic, enacted on January 1, 1948, explicitly rejected war as an instrument of policy, marking a complete break from the militarism of the fascist era. Former colonial officials and soldiers returned to civilian life, while war crimes committed in Africa and the Balkans remained largely unpunished due to Cold War political considerations. By the close of 1947, Italy's imperial project had formally ended. Its overseas territories were dismantled, its monarchy abolished, and its foreign policy reoriented toward cooperation rather than conquest. What remained of the former empire existed only in the administrative transitions of its ex-colonies, which awaited new paths to independence under international oversight. After World War II, Italy's imperial ambitions formally ended. The defeat of the fascist regime and the occupation by Allied forces led to a complete reevaluation of Italy's overseas possessions. The Treaty of Peace with Italy, signed in Paris on February 10, 1947, marked the official dissolution of the Italian Empire. Under this treaty, Italy renounced all territorial claims to its colonies in Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, and recognized the independence or future self-determination of these territories under international supervision. Libya, occupied by the British in the west and the French in the south since 1943, was placed under Allied administration until the issue of its final status could be decided. The United Nations General Assembly resolved in November 1949 that Libya would become fully independent by January 1, 1952. In the meantime, Italy played no official role in its administration. The Kingdom of Libya was proclaimed on December 24, 1951, under King Idris I, uniting Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan into one state. The United Nations decided in December 1950 that Eritrea would be federated with Ethiopia under Haile Selassie's sovereignty, with internal autonomy guaranteed. The federation took effect on September 15, 1952. This settlement formally ended any Italian claim to the territory. Italian Somaliland, meanwhile, followed a different path. In December 1950, the United Nations placed it under Italian trusteeship for a period of 10 years, beginning on April 1, 1950, with the condition that Italy prepare the territory for full independence. This trusteeship, known as the Amministrazione Fiduciaria Italiana della Somalia, the FIS, restored Italy's administrative presence but under international supervision and without colonial privileges. During this decade, Italian officials reorganized the civil service, legal system, and education sector while cooperating with Somali leaders. The territory achieved independence on July 1, 1960, merging with British Somaliland to form the Somali Republic. This event marked the definitive end of Italian authority in Africa. The collapse of the empire had profound domestic consequences. Thousands of Italian settlers were repatriated from North and East Africa between 1943 and the early 1950s, many facing economic hardship upon return. Veterans of colonial campaigns and officials from the Ministry of the Colonies were largely absorbed into other government sectors or retired. Italy's post-war governments, under Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi and later leaders, avoided public debate about the imperial past. Official rhetoric focused instead on reconstruction, democratization, and integration into Western alliances. Italy's foreign policy shifted toward Atlantic and European cooperation. It joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949 and became a founding member of the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1957. The emphasis moved from colonial expansion to economic modernization and participation in collective defense. Relations with former colonies were limited but cautiously restored through trade and technical cooperation. Italian companies later participated in oil exploration in Libya and development projects in Somalia. Culturally, the memory of the Italian Empire faded quickly. Public discussion of colonialism remained minimal throughout the 1950s. Historians, politicians, and the press tended to characterize the empire as a short, misguided experiment. School curricula avoided extensive treatment of the colonial period, and official commemoration was rare. The national narrative instead emphasized Italy's transformation from a defeated state into a democratic republic and an industrial power within Europe. Yet traces of the imperial era persisted. Italian architecture, infrastructure, and language continued to influence cities like Asmara, Mogadishu, and Tripoli. Some local elites educated under Italian rule maintained ties with Rome. Migration patterns reversed slightly as small numbers of Africans came to Italy for study or work. Diplomatic missions were re-established and cultural agreements were signed to maintain contact, especially with Somalia. By 1960, Italy's imperial story had concluded. From unification in 1861 through expansion, conquest, and eventual collapse, the empire had lasted less than a century. Its territories were now independent states navigating post-colonial challenges. For Italy, the experience left an ambiguous legacy: limited material gain, complex moral reckoning, and lasting influence in certain regions. The period after 1960 marked the transition from an imperial to a post-imperial nation, focused on European integration and global diplomacy rather than territorial ambition. After the final dissolution of Italy's colonial responsibilities in 1960, the Italian state entered a new phase defined by reconstruction, economic transformation, and the gradual reassessment of its imperial past. The post-imperial era was marked by a decisive break from the expansionist and militarist ideologies that had shaped national policy during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Instead, Italy's leadership sought to stabilize domestic politics, modernize the economy, and realign the country with Western institutions. By the early 1960s, Italy was firmly positioned within the framework of the Cold War. As a founding member of NATO, 1949, and the European Economic Community, 1957, its foreign policy focused on Atlantic cooperation and European integration. The loss of the empire did not immediately lead to introspection or historical analysis. Rather, the political class emphasized Italy's role as a democratic bulwark against communism. Colonial history was often treated as a closed chapter, overshadowed by the pressing issues of industrialization, economic reform, and internal political conflict. Economically, the 1960s marked a period of rapid development known as the Italian economic miracle, 1958 to 1963. Industrial output surged, exports increased, and living standards improved dramatically. Cities in northern Italy, such as Milan, Turin, and Genoa, became industrial hubs, while millions of Italians migrated from the rural south to urban centers. This transformation absorbed the nation's attention, leaving little room for reflection on imperial losses or post-colonial consequences. The colonial legacy became a peripheral subject in political discourse, viewed by most as a historical footnote rather than a defining national experience. Diplomatic relations with former colonies remained limited but functional. Italy maintained cultural and economic ties with Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, often through trade and development programs. In the case of Libya, relations improved under King Idris I, and later with Muammar Gaddafi following his coup in 1969. Italian companies participated in oil extraction and infrastructure projects, though political relations were periodically strained. When Libya nationalized foreign oil assets in 1970 and expelled remaining Italian residents, Rome responded cautiously, avoiding confrontation. The two countries eventually restored cooperation in the 1970s through energy agreements and trade. With Somalia, ties remained relatively close during the 1960s and 1970s. Development aid and technical cooperation programs continued, focusing on agriculture, education, and governance. However, as Somalia moved toward political instability in the late 1970s, Italian influence declined. The academic and cultural reassessment of Italy's imperial period began slowly in the 1970s and 1980s. Early post-war historiography had minimized colonialism's role, portraying it as a marginal or even benevolent endeavor. This interpretation began to change as scholars gained access to archives and re-examined the policies implemented in Africa. Studies on the use of chemical weapons in Ethiopia, 1935 to 1936, the repression of resistance in Libya, and the forced labor systems in East Africa challenged earlier narratives. Universities and research institutions began organizing conferences and publications that reintroduced Italy's empire into public discussion. Politically, Italy's governments during this period, dominated by the Christian democracy, Democrazia Cristiana, avoided extensive engagement with the colonial question. The focus remained on domestic modernization, European integration, and managing social tensions during the years of lead, Annie di Piombo, from the late 1960s to the 1980s. The colonial past occasionally surfaced in debates about foreign aid, migration, or the treatment of Italian communities expelled from Africa, but these discussions were secondary to the broader national agenda. Cultural production also began to revisit imperial themes, though often indirectly. Films, literature, and documentaries explored the fascist era, with occasional reference to colonial ventures as part of Italy's broader authoritarian experience. Public memory, however, remained fragmented. Monuments from the fascist period, including those glorifying the empire, were largely left intact but reinterpreted as historical artifacts rather than symbols of pride. Museums devoted to colonial history remained few, and official commemorations were minimal. Migration and globalization in the late 20th century introduced new dimensions to Italy's post-imperial reality. From the 1980s onward, Italy began to receive immigrants from the Horn of Africa and North Africa, regions that had once been part of its colonial empire. These migration patterns prompted renewed interest in the historical connections between Italy and Africa. Former colonial subjects and their descendants brought with them languages, traditions, and memories linked to Italian rule. This demographic shift subtly reintroduced the colonial past into Italian public consciousness, though often through social rather than academic discourse. By the end of the 1980s, Italy had consolidated its position as a modern European democracy and a key economic power within the European community. The empire, once central to the nationalist ambitions of the late 19th century, had been transformed into a subject of historical inquiry and occasional diplomatic reference. The Italian state no longer pursued territorial expansion or imperial prestige. Its international strategy centered on economic cooperation, regional diplomacy, and participation in multilateral institutions. Throughout this period, the legacy of the Italian Empire persisted in subtle forms, through architecture in Africa, shared cultural elements, and unresolved questions about wartime conduct. The 1980s marked the beginning of a more critical engagement with this past, setting the stage for broader discussions in the following decades about memory, responsibility, and the place of colonialism in modern Italian history. The Italian Empire, from its foundation in the 19th century to its final dissolution in the mid-20th century, reflected the broader European pattern of nationalism, expansion, and decolonization. It emerged from Italy's struggle for unification and the desire to establish parity with other imperial powers such as Britain, France, and Germany. The empire's growth and decline illustrate the limits of latecomer colonialism and the transformations that reshaped global politics after 1945. The origins of Italy's imperial ambition were rooted in national insecurity. Having achieved unification only in 1861, Italy entered the international arena with limited resources but strong ideological aspirations. Nationalists viewed overseas expansion as essential for demonstrating Italy's arrival as a great power and for addressing internal social and economic pressures. Colonialism was promoted as a means to relieve population density, create new markets, and restore a sense of Roman-era grandeur. These motives converged under successive governments, both liberal and fascist, though with different methods and ideological frameworks. In comparative terms, Italy's empire was smaller and shorter-lived than those of other European states. Yet, its impact was disproportionate to its size because of the intersection between domestic politics and imperial ambition. Colonial failures such as the defeat at Ottawa in 1896 deeply affected national consciousness, shaping Italian attitudes toward power, race, and modernization. The pursuit of revenge for this defeat under Mussolini's regime in the 1930s demonstrated how imperialism became a core component of fascist propaganda and state policy. The Italian Empire also revealed the contradictions of liberal imperialism. In the late 19th century, the monarchy and parliamentary governments justified expansion through claims of modernization, trade, and civilization. But the methods often mirrored the coercion used by other colonial powers. Forced labor, land appropriation, and suppression of local resistance characterized Italian rule in Eritrea, Somalia, and Libya. The notion of a mild Italian colonialism, popularized in early post-war discourse, was later disproven through archival research documenting massacres, deportations, and chemical warfare during the Ethiopian campaign of 1935 to 1936. The fascist period marked the empire's most aggressive and ideologically driven phase. Between 1935 and 1941, Italy attempted to create a new Roman Empire, encompassing the Horn of Africa, North Africa, and the Balkans. This vision was supported by extensive propaganda linking modern Italy to the ancient Roman legacy. Public works, settler colonies, and racial legislation followed, designed to institutionalize Italian dominance over African populations. Despite its brief existence, this period left enduring traces in urban infrastructure, land policies, and demographic changes across Libya and the Horn of Africa. The collapse of the empire during World War II demonstrated the fragility of imperial structures built on coercion rather than sustainable governance. Military defeats in North Africa and East Africa between 1941 and 1943 dismantled Italy's colonial administration within a few years. This early decolonization, however, occurred through defeat and external imposition rather than voluntary withdrawal, influencing Italy's later discomfort in addressing its colonial past. Globally, the Italian Empire's impact extended beyond territorial boundaries. In East Africa, Italian rule contributed to infrastructural modernization in cities such as Asmara, Massawa, and Mogadishu, where roads, administrative buildings, and communication systems were established. However, These developments primarily served the colonial apparatus and Italian settlers rather than local populations. After independence, many former colonies inherited both the material infrastructure and the administrative patterns introduced during Italian rule. Some retained elements of the Italian language in governance and education for decades. Demographically, Italian migration to Africa created settler communities, particularly in Libya and Eritrea. After decolonization, these communities were expelled or assimilated, and their displacement shaped post-war Italian politics. The repatriation of former colonists and soldiers added pressure to Italy's recovery efforts in the late 1940s. Although the empire's end reduced Italy's international status, it also redirected national focus toward domestic modernization and European integration. The ideological consequences of empire were equally significant. Fascist propaganda had deeply intertwined nationalism with imperialism, and the sudden loss of colonies required a redefinition of national identity. Post-1945 governments sought legitimacy through democracy and reconstruction rather than conquest. The memory of empire was gradually marginalized in public education and cultural discourse, creating what historians later described as collective amnesia. For decades, Italian society remembered its empire through nostalgic or sanitized narratives, portraying it as an episode of benign paternalism rather than exploitation. From a global perspective, the Italian Empire contributed to the complex legacy of European colonialism in Africa. Italian rule in Eritrea, Somalia, Libya, and Ethiopia intersected with the broader processes of resistance and independence that shaped 20th century African history. Anti-colonial movements in these territories drew on the experience of Italian occupation as part of their collective struggle. The Ethiopian victory at Adwa, 1896, for instance, became a powerful symbol of African resistance against European domination and remains a cornerstone of Pan-African identity. The economic dimension of Italy's empire also reflected the contradictions of colonial ambition. Despite heavy investment in infrastructure and settler agriculture, the colonies produced limited profit. The costs of conquest, administration, and military defense outweighed economic returns. This imbalance weakened the empire's sustainability and undermined domestic support. By the 1930s, even as propaganda celebrated imperial glory, many Italians viewed the colonies as a financial burden rather than an opportunity for prosperity. In the post-colonial era, Italy's relationships with its former colonies evolved into patterns of economic cooperation, development aid, and migration. Former colonial subjects often studied or worked in Italy, establishing new cultural connections that replaced the old imperial hierarchy. Over time, these exchanges contributed to the multicultural dimension of modern Italian society. However, the reluctance to confront colonial violence delayed public understanding of its historical and moral implications. Scholarly reassessment in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has reinserted the Italian Empire into global historical narratives. Researchers have documented the use of concentration camps in Libya, 1930 to 1933, the forced labor policies in East Africa, and the racial segregation laws of 1938, linking Italy's colonial practices to the wider European imperial context. International collaboration between Italian and African historians has produced more balanced accounts, emphasizing local perspectives and the long-term social consequences of colonialism. In the broader context of world history, The Italian Empire serves as a case study of late European imperialism. Its rise illustrates the ambitions of newly unified nation-states to claim global prestige, while its fall demonstrates the fragility of empires based on ideology rather than administrative capacity. The Italian experience also highlights the continuity between colonialism and domestic authoritarianism. Methods of control and propaganda developed in the colonies later reappeared in fascist domestic policy. Today, the influence of the Italian Empire remains visible in multiple forms. Architectural styles, linguistic traces, and diasporic connections link Italy with its former territories. At the same time, debates over migration, memory, and historical responsibility continue to shape contemporary Italian politics. The reassessment of the empire is not only an academic pursuit, but part of Italy's ongoing effort to reconcile national identity with its global past. The history of the Italian Empire, 1861 to 1960 AD, thus encapsulates a full cycle of national aspiration, expansion, collapse, and reflection. Its legacy endures in the shared spaces of the Mediterranean and East Africa, where history, culture, and memory intersect long after the empire itself ceased to exist.